very nice to be back. Thank you, Jakob, for inviting me back. I'm delighted to be back here at Still Point and to see it evolve. When I was here, this floor wasn't operational. So now there's a storefront, it's on this street. It's very exciting. It's a very unique and original project, and I'm really happy to support it in any way that I can, right? Even by giving lectures on Luther. So here it is. That's the essence of secularization and globalization, is it not? You have a philosopher from Newfoundland traveling to Berlin to give a lecture on Luther. It's insane, but that's it. Everything is fluid now. Everything is fluid, and nothing is really nothing is what it was. So this is not a lecture on theology. I'll go for about 45 minutes, and then we'll discuss. This is a lecture on culture and on the origins of our culture and the origins of the modern individual. But in order to make that case, we have to talk about theology. So it was, as Jakob said, 500 years ago, 1517, Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to a door in a church in Wittenberg. You know, that wasn't, people think he was like, it was like, a revolutionary act, like nailing the theses to the door. That's just what you did. He was actually invited to have a dispute, a scholastic dispute. He was a scholastic, a monk. And the subject of the disputatio was put on the door of the church so that everybody would know what was going to follow the next day. And what followed the next day was nothing short of the beginning of the Reformation. Because in those 95 Theses, Luther deconstructed medieval Christianity. But it wasn't only the beginning of the Reformation, it was also the birth of the modern individual. And perhaps that's the most important point to connect Luther to what's happening here in Still Point, is that there would be no Still Point, there'd be no psychoanalysis, no Freud, Jung, no modern psychology at all, had Luther not nailed those 95 Theses to the door in Wittenberg. You know, that's one of those exaggerations that we make all the time. But somebody else probably would have come along and nailed something like that to the door. It was happening. He was the man, he was the romantic genius whose spontaneous expressions was giving articulation to what everybody was feeling, but without having the categories for it. And it was an incendiary moment. So the core of Luther's theology is the rejection of clerical mediation, institutional mediation. This is summed up in the phrase Sola Fide, faith alone. To our ears, that doesn't sound revolutionary, but to a medieval, it was revolutionary. It meant no church, no priest, no sacrament. It meant no pious works. It meant no asceticism, no fasting, no religious practice can save me. Now, Luther didn't say we should stop all these things and tear churches down, but we have to understand what their function is. Their function is not to save the individual. The individual cannot be saved through any process of mediation. And this placed the emphasis on the individual in a way that it had never been done before. So, of course, there was a sense for subjectivity in the Middle Ages. You know, there was medieval mysticism. There was a whole doctrine of the interiority of the person in the Middle Ages. Is well developed, but it had never been put in such a position. It had never become the centerpiece and the site of salvation as it did in Luther's Reformation. It's worth noting that in the ancient world, the pre-Christian world, there is no such concept of the individual. The individual as subject, as an interior space, if you like, an interior space wherein the individual's salvation is worked out in fear and trembling, as St. Paul puts it, and Kierkegaard picks it up. A place of meaning that is sui generis. It's only your meaning. It's nobody else's meaning. Now, this all sounds all very liberating, but for Luther, it was terrifying. It meant, of course, that there was no security, because the individual could not save himself. The individual could only be saved by an act of God, and you would never know if you had been the one so chosen. So you lived your life in complete uncertainty about your destiny, whether it was heaven or hell, and there was nothing you could do about it. So anxiety becomes the predominant condition of human life, and moreover, it is a purely individual anxiety, an anxiety that is born by the individual alone. No amount of confession, no amount of sacramental works, no amount of religious life can relieve you of this burden. Not only that, Luther would say, to try to be relieved of this, to want to be relieved of this burden is to commit an act of unfaith. It is unbelief that shirks the burden, the anxiety of standing alone before God. Therefore, the faithful one is the one who is most anxious and stays with the anxiety. And that's the theology of the cross in a nutshell. So not only does the individual now have a responsibility to find a path to the truth, unaided by traditions and institutions, now the arena for this work, the place where the place where you work out your salvation in fear and trembling is not a church or a monastery, it's the world. That is, it's the street, to pick up on the theme of psychoanalysis on the street. It's the home, it's the workplace, it's the field. So all of that secular life is, in an analogous way, sanctified by Luther's rejection of the mediation by the church. And this, of course, is the origins of secularism as well. So my remarks today are going to follow these. I have 5 points really to make. I want to tell you something about the medieval system of salvation. I want to tell you something about the idea of deconstruction, the Derridian idea, Jacques Derrida, postmodernism, behind him Heidegger, and show how this idea has its very roots in this rejection of mediation by Luther. I want to say something about the turn to the world and the secular. And I want to root those 3 points in Luther's distinction between Theologia Gloriae and Theologia Crucis. Theologia Gloriae, the theology of glory, is the theology of the Middle Ages. Theologia Crucis, the theology of the cross, is the theology that Luther says is the authentic proclamation of the gospel that had been lost in the Middle Ages when a substitute was overlaid upon it, the theology of glory. And then just finish with this comment on this return to the primordial insecurity of existence. Yeah, so about 40 minutes. So, and then we can have an open discussion. I have a couple pictures to show you. So let's go back to the Middle Ages. Luther was a medieval man, right? So at 1517, they didn't call themselves modern. Well, in fact, they did, but they understood the term in a medieval sense. The first moderns were actually medieval architects. It was the description of Gothic architecture, the modern style. But they didn't understand, Luther didn't understand himself to be involved in this project of modernity because, in fact, it had not yet begun, or it was beginning in him. And a beginning never knows itself. When something begins, it begins in unawareness of what's beginning. And so there's Luther, really without any sense at all that something enormous is beginning in his work. He thinks he's part of the medieval world. He is, in fact, part of the medieval world. He's an Augustinian monk. He spent his adult life in a cloister, fasting, praying, working with the poor, doing the kinds of things that medieval monks and clerics and nuns habitually did as expressions of their place in the world and also expressions of their zeal to do as much as they possibly could in order to earn their spot in heaven, so to speak. The medieval world stands in stark contrast with our world inasmuch as it was a world in which everybody had a place. Everybody knew where they belonged. It was a heavily stratified world. So a peasant knew what a peasant was and what a peasant ought to do to be a good peasant. And similarly, a prince knew who he was and what he ought to do to be a good prince. And a priest knew what a priest was. And they didn't move around. There wasn't, social mobility was not part of the world. It was a hierarchical world, with classes organized, stacked on top of each other, from the most powerful on the top to the least powerful on the bottom. And we think, oh, that's awful and repressive. But let's think for a moment about what one of the pleasant aspects of a hierarchically, socially stratified existence. Everyone knew their place. They did not suffer the anxiety that we suffer habitually of rootlessness, placelessness, making ourselves. They weren't involved in the project of creating an identity. They didn't need to. They stepped into their identity like stepping into a suit of clothes that was prepared for them, and that was it. So there is a great consolation here. Or if you put it in a reverse way, much of modern angst has to do with the rootlessness, placelessness, lack of clear identity of the individual. We have social mobility, but we have it at the cost, you could say, of the consolation of belonging to a stable world. So the individual's meaning and purpose in the Middle Ages was found entirely in the class to which he or she belonged and in the communal meanings associated therewith. You didn't have to look into your heart to figure out how to be a good peasant. Everybody knew what it was. You could just look at the peasantry around you. Similarly, if you were abusing your position as a prince or as a king or as a queen, there was a whole communal system in place to remind you of that abuse. There was a kind of objectivity to meaning, you could say, in the Middle Ages. Now, Luther did not break with the medieval world because he wanted to emancipate the individual. That wouldn't have made any sense to him. In fact, he did emancipate the individual, but he didn't mean to. What he meant to do was he meant to break with the Roman Catholic system of the Roman Catholic ecclesiastical system for theological reasons. Now, he had very good reasons, and almost all Catholics will recognize that there were some terrible things happening in the Middle Ages that Luther had every reason to break with, you know. The sale of indulgences, of course, was the principal problem, and this had become hugely abused. It's actually, just as a footnote, it's based in the Roman Catholic idea of purgatory. So if your soul could end up in this place between earth and heaven where it's getting purified for its sins, and this purification is kind of painful, then perhaps something that we do here for the departed could alleviate their pain and get them, you know, to heaven quicker. Well, what the church did, of course, is it abused the anxiety of the medieval person, the medieval believer, that their beloved are suffering in the torment. It abused this anxiety by saying, if you give money to us, we will grant you an indulgence, and the souls of your beloved relatives will be forgiven their sins and granted absolution from their purgations. And the church did it to raise money. And they particularly did it in an intense way in the 16th century because they were building a very big church, which was St. Peter's. So all across Europe, these preachers were going around instilling in the ordinary Christian the absolute terror that their beloved ones are suffering, and they could do something about it if they would just give some money to the church. So Luther said, this is an abuse. And of course it is. But he found in the abuse something that he thought was basically theologically wrong with the whole of medieval Christianity. Namely, that the church mediates between Jesus Christ, our Savior, and the individual believer. That is, we go through the church to get to him. And Luther, being the scripture scholar that he was, he kind of created the modern German by translating the Bible into German. He realized that this was not the gospel. This is not written in the Gospels. There's no church in early Christianity. This is not even in St. Paul. On the contrary, it's a complete inversion of the gospel. And it sets up a kind of a screen of privileged individuals who stand between us and salvation. And these individuals are priests. And the priests have control over grace. They dispense it as they will. They do it in the Mass when they say the Eucharist. They do it in the confessional when they absolve you of your sins. They do it in baptism. They do it in marriage. They do it in last rites. Your whole life stands at the mercy of not God who created us and died for us, but priests who seem to have taken the whole thing captive in order to put themselves in a privileged position. When Luther broke with this system and said, no mediation, the individual is alone before God and is saved by virtue of faith alone, sola fide, when he broke with this system, he unleashed a sequence of unforeseen effects that not only emancipated the individual from religion, but it emancipated the individual socially, economically, psychologically, and theologically. So Luther is the father of secularism in many ways, because to be secular is to be emancipated from every social, economic, psychological, and religious context out of which you have come. That is, of course, we all have contexts, but you're not defined by it. You can redefine yourself. The whole fascination with shopping in our culture, in my view, has to do with this very spiritual sense that we are the architects of our identity. What do people buy when they shop? Stuff? No, they're not hoarders. Hoarding is not the essence of consumerism. Hoarding is like a perversion of consumerism. We look at hoarders like freaks. We watch them on TV. No, the ideal consumer is quite ready to get rid of all his old stuff because he wants new stuff, because he's building up an identity continually, experimenting with identity. So now, another theological point here. In order to make this, underscore this unmediated quality of Christian existence, Luther gave the most negative account possible of what human beings are capable of. So in the Middle Ages, there was a widespread understanding that the human being made in the image of God can really do something on its own. In fact, it can do quite a bit. It can build glorious churches. It can actually organize all of knowledge. It can understand nature better than Aristotle. It can even connect Aristotle's science to, the Gospels and create a whole new system of theology, a compendium of knowledge. Reason in the Middle Ages was an instrument to reach God. Now, the medievals, of course, said you needed help along the way, but you could certainly do quite a bit. And Luther said, not only is reason incapable of reaching God, it's actually allergic to God. Reason hates God. He said, the medievals said we have a natural desire for God, a desiderium naturale, centerpiece of Thomas Aquinas' theology. Luther says we have an aversio Dei, an aversion to God. We hate God. And this hate is so deep that it could only really be described in the language of the unconscious. It's not thematized. Our hatred and aversion to the true God is so deep that we actually don't even think it. What we do is we substitute gods of our choice, gods that we like, for the true God that we hate. So we create a mythic God. We create an ideological God that's more suited to our identities and to our sense of ourselves and our egoism, and protects us from this God who is so terrible that he cannot be looked at in the Old Testament. Revelation breaks through this wall of God hatred, which is the human condition after the fall, and says something that we don't understand. It's incomprehensible to us because it is coming from an entirely different place. It's coming from a place of holiness. It's coming from a place of truth. We live in sin and falsehood. So we hear the revelation and we hear a language that we do not understand. And the process of translating this language is extremely difficult because there's always a tendency in every translation to lose the language that's being translated. And this is more or less what the deconstruction of Christianity is about. Let us get back to the original sources of this God language that breaks into our world at a certain time and for which we have no natural capacity. Let us return to those sources by tearing down all of the falsehoods, all of the malevolently motivated concepts that we have overlaid it with, all of the idols and ideology that we have laid on it over the centuries, the cult of the saints and the various medieval doctrines, many of the dogmas of the church. Tear it all down in order to release this living source of life which is buried underneath it so that it might live again. So that is the idea. Oh, no, I'm just going to keep that there. I just have a couple pictures. That brings me to the second point, which is the idea of deconstruction. Deconstruction is not a hot topic anymore, but it certainly was, 20 years ago. It's all anybody ever talked about. And in deconstruction, we are told a text, any text, this text, can be shown to be free of any authorial intention, the meaning I put into it, or even any essential meaning, the meaning it might have, and demonstrated to mean the opposite of what it's typically held to mean, or what the author might have intended it to mean. This is the work of Jacques Derrida. When Jacques Derrida reads a text, what he does is he demonstrates that the text says things that it doesn't know that it's saying, so to speak. It says things which do not conform to the author's intention, nor to the received opinions about the text. And by virtue of the text alone, you could make the text pluralize its meanings. There's a polysemy of meaning. It's out of control in a certain way. And interpretation is deeply uncertain. Every act of understanding the text is an act of changing the text, doing violence to the text. And every time you read a text, you interpret a text because time has brought you into a different place, a different situation, because the reader has a different set of ideas, because there's a different a motivation to every reading. So the text is fractured into an uncontrollable infinity of meanings, which can be even shown to contradict each other. But before there was Derrida, there was Heidegger. And Heidegger didn't speak about deconstruction. He spoke about destruction, destruction. Heidegger said, I shall be the Luther of metaphysics. And what I'll do is I will destroy philosophy to get back to its original sources, which have been concealed and obscured by modern philosophy and its conceptions of the subject, of the object, of truth, of falsehood, its technocratic way of looking at things. I'm going to tear all of this crap off of the tradition in order to make the sources of metaphysics, the sources of Western philosophy live again. And what will happen when I get back to these original sources is not that we'll return to some other earlier moment in our history, but something absolutely new will begin, because these sources of philosophy, Heidegger said, are not finished with us. They're still giving. So in my first book, I think I proved that the source for Heidegger's understanding of destruction is his early reading of Luther. This idea that traditional interpretations and historical presuppositions overlay associations onto concepts or texts or themes that block the original sources of meaning. And the destruction, while it's negative, has a positive intent to make something that's morbid and dead live again. To free up something which has become stale and make it meaningful in a new way. So an example of a deconstruction, as I said, is Heidegger and metaphysics, Luther and the New Testament. And I think you could even make a case for Jung and the primordial sense of archetypal symbols, which, when Jung's at his best, what he's trying to do is he's trying to make these symbols live again, symbols that have become held captive in systems of meaning. So that was the project of Luther. Here was one of the consequences, that by way of getting to the big thing, which is the individual. As we said, when you tear down mediation, you also turn to the world in a certain way. So in the medieval situation, there's a strict separation between the sacred and the secular. They're two parallel universes. The sacred, of course, is in heaven, and the secular is our world here below, a place of suffering, a place that we long to be free of on our way to another place. And in between is the mediator, the church, right? Sort of managing this kind of transmission of individuals stuck in the secular back into the sacred. Luther tears out the mediation, says the individual is alone with the scripture and with their anxiety and with the gift of faith, should God give it to them. And where ought they to work out their salvation? In a monastery? On the contrary. So Luther's first act was to tear down the walls. One of the difficulties that the Reformation brought about, one of the many difficulties, is it tore down cloistered walls that were holding up countless women in convents and flooded the community with them. And in those days, you couldn't just have women roaming about. They had to have a man attached to them. Part of the function of the cloister was it kept them, it gave them another alternative. And so the destruction of the cloister caused an extraordinary transformation in the visibility of women in society. That's by way of side note. But it wasn't only women, it was every kind of worldly work suddenly became more dignified. So here's a citation from Luther. I only have a couple. However numerous, sacred, and arduous they may be, these works, in God's sight, are in no way superior to the works of a farmer laboring in the field or a woman looking after her home. What is he talking about? Works. He's talking about saying Mass if you're a priest, or attending Eucharist if you're a parishioner, or fasting because it's Friday, or giving alms to the poor, or saying the rosary every night, or just trying to be a good person. Anything that we try to do to earn salvation is of no significance to God. God will save who he chooses to save. Sola gratia is the other part of the formula. Sola fide is faith alone. Sola gratia, by grace alone. God chooses the ones he will save. Puny people like us, in the grip of the aversion to God, we can't do anything to earn his favor. So all of that stuff is not worth anything. That's the negative way to put it. Here he puts it positively. They are no way superior to the works of a farmer laboring in the field or a woman looking after her home. In the Middle Ages, of course, we understood these secular tasks to be of no value whatsoever. They didn't earn us any kind of salvation. And now, by leveling the field, so to speak, Luther is elevating ordinary stuff. So, sweeping the floor, tilling a field, earning money in the marketplace. All of this worldly activity is not outside the religious, it is religious. This thesis was picked up by, or was formulated by Max Weber in the beginning of the 20th century in a very famous book called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, where Weber says that capitalism as such would not exist without this elevation of ordinary life by the Reformation. Because what, of course, happened is that business people began to look at their work as a religious duty. And that meant that they shouldn't indulge themselves in the wealth that they earn. What they should do is earn as much as they possibly can, maximize profit, be as productive as possible while remaining a virtuous Christian person, exhaust themselves in the production of wealth. And without this kind of infinite productivity, capitalism doesn't work. Weber notes that there's something really extraordinary about capitalist cultures. They work their asses off, like they work way harder than the Middle Ages, than the medieval people did, right? There's a sense that work is all there is. And according to Weber, this comes from the Reformation. So with this dismantling of the Catholic two-tiered system of sacred and secular, the call to holiness, every Christian is called to holiness, is democratized. Now all are called to perfection, not just special people who are selected and put into monasteries. And the site of such perfection is no longer cloister or monastery, but the world. This brings me to the fourth point then, which is the kind of core, which is the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. So what is this about? Luther says these are these two ways in which we understand the revelation of God. In one way, the medieval way, the Catholic way, we say that the revelation of God radiates through creation. It's just everywhere. It's in the trees and the flowers. It's in human reason. You can see God everywhere. You can deduce God from the things that you see around you. You can prove him in countless ways. You don't need to rely on his revelation to get to him because he shows himself in everything. Glory is a word that refers to the shining of something. So the theology of glory is the shining of God in everything. The theology of the cross refers to the hiddenness of God in the cross of Christ. The cross of Christ is not glorious, it's hideous. It's not exalted, it's humiliated. It's an image of suffering and shame. It's such a painful image that the early church didn't even depict it. It wasn't really depicted until Constantinian Christianity, a good 4 centuries after the New Testament. Now, of course, we associate it with Christianity. But we have to remember that to be crucified was to suffer the worst type of rejection society could impose on you. Crucifixion, as we know, was something that citizens of the Roman Empire were not vulnerable to. That was by virtue of being a citizen, you were safe from being crucified. You might be beheaded, as Paul was, but you didn't need to suffer this worst of all deaths, the death of an outcast, of vermin, of somebody whose death is being made into a public show for all to see. That was the point. Slow death, hanging on a cross so the world can watch you slowly and painfully expire and perhaps hurl insults at you. It was in a hierarchical society a way of indicating, here is the lowest, this is the worst, this is the garbage of civilization. And so now you have the Savior of the world identified with the lowest, or the highest has become the lowest, or the highest shows itself in the lowest. Luther said, that is not rational. That breaks categories. That's an absurdity, as Kierkegaard would say. It is the absurd. Don't tell me that reason brings you to the cross. Reason doesn't bring you to the cross. Here is the place where God reveals himself, and what he reveals is something ungodly, the non-godly. The only proper response to the cross is faith, because you will not be able to categorize it. You will not be able to put it into some kind of comprehensible system of your own. And properly understood, the cross upsets everything. It upsets our natural value system. It upsets our sense of what's right and what's wrong. So the theologian of the cross, the theology of the cross, the theologian of the cross is the one who stays with the crucified in faith rather than substituting some kind of rational explanation that's more agreeable to his or her reason. So these were the Heidelberg theses. Here's Luther again. That person is not rightly called a theologian who looks upon the invisible things of God as though they were clearly perceptible through things that have actually happened. He, however, deserves to be called a theologian who understands the visible and manifest things of God seen through suffering and the cross. A theology of glory calls evil good and good evil. A theology of the cross calls the thing what it actually is. So in the theology of glory, and this is the best image I could think of, in the theology of glory, you have an aesthetic approach to the divine. Aesthetic, referring to our senses and to art and to beauty. It's the theology that proves God's existence. It's the theology that finds God in everything. It's the theology that cannot get enough of making imagery of God. This is the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, the private chapel of the kings of France. An absolutely gorgeous thing. But in many ways, it expresses in architecture the spirit of this theology of glory. So the revelation occurs in the crucified. And what the medieval church does is turns away from that and instead creates a temple more beautiful than any temple that almost puts a bridge between the human and the divine. If the crucified shows that the human and the divine only meet in the place of suffering and conflict and where the high becomes the low, the theology of glory says, no, we can bring these things together. We can bring the low to the high. We can build a bridge. We can make the walls so high that it almost seems as though the columns, the arches will never meet. It'll go all the way to infinity. And between the walls, we'll fill them with glass, with colored glass, depicting all of the ways in which God shows himself. The whole thing is like a great theater of God. This is not the God who is hidden. This is the God who is ubiquitously manifest in the things that he has made and in the mind of man and in the works of man. And this would be the alternative. Now, this is also a painting, a famous painting by Matthias Grunewald, the Isenheim altar, which is in Colmar. And Grunewald was a contemporary of Luther's, and he's sympathetic to the Lutheran Reformation. And this crucifix is noted in the history of art for being the most disturbing depiction of the crucified, at least up until that time. The suffering of the crucified is absolutely unmitigated. In fact, he's covered in sores. The painting was done on an altarpiece for a hospital in Colmar, and the room in the hospital where it was, for which it was commissioned, was the place that they brought individuals who were suffering from a form of plague. I think it was called St. Anthony's fire, which had no cure and which had as its symptoms ulcers and sores all over the body that couldn't heal. And so what Grunewald has done is he's painted the crucified with St. Anthony's fire. But what's striking about the painting, of course, is there's no glory in it at all. This is not an exalted person. This is the tortured, this is the broken and the rejected. How could this be God? And yet, that's what the Revelation says. Reason cannot assent to the divinity of this. Only faith can. So the theologian of the cross is the theologian who stays with the absurdity of the revealed, who stays with the hiddenness of God. Luther said, God doesn't so much show himself in the cross as hide himself forever. In other words, now we know that there is no way into him, that there is no natural image save this that will bring us there. And this image is the image of God sub contraria, in his subspecie contraria, in an opposite category, in a non-divine, the divine as not divine. So when Luther describes this theology of the cross, he does so in the most existential terms. He speaks about the individual alone before the suffering of God and his own individual suffering and the unresolvedness of life, with nothing but hope in the God who alone can save him. And he himself can't even generate the hope. The individual will receive the hope and the faith as a gift. So another citation from Luther. The theologian of the cross is always beginning, always seeking and renewing his quest. And he who does not renew his quest loses what he has found, since one cannot stand still on the road to God. So there's no security, there's no safety here. You're not given anything that can abrogate or make or lighten the burden and the anxiety of existence. On the contrary, what you're given is something that makes your existence even more anxious. Because now the image of God, the only adequate image of God is of God as suffering, as not God. And moreover, there is no mediation for you. There is no church that can help you in this. Only faith can help you. And faith is God's gift, not your work. So you're on your own. And this drove Luther to speak of the human being in terms that almost sound like 20th century existentialism. Listen to this passage. This could be Heidegger. It isn't. It's Martin Luther. Human being is always in privation, always in becoming, or in potentiality, in matter, and always in action. Human being is always non-being. This was what the Theology of Glory fled from, substituted another story for it. This is what Luther frees up from the medieval tradition to make alive again. So this means, of course, that to live as a Christian is to live in a state of primal insecurity. You're called to work out your salvation in fear and trembling. But you'll never pull it off yourself, and you'll never be sure whether you have, and nobody can share the burden with you. You're alone with it. Ever vulnerable to despair, to doubt, and sin. The condition of this life is not one of having God, but of seeking God. So we bring us then out of the theology then to the present moment. What is the secular condition? What is secularism? There are lots of definitions of secularism. People say secularism is life without religion. I don't think very many people believe this anymore, because religion famously has refused to go away. Secularism is not life without religion. Secularism is pluralism. Secularism is the pluralization of religion, of philosophy, of science, of the various models for living. And this plurality is not a plurality of communities, it's a plurality of individuals, each of whom is free to choose their own path in the great smorgasbord of globalized offerings for meaning. We can, of course, celebrate this condition, but we can also recognize it as the place where we suffer most. There's a special kind of modern suffering typical of the secular condition. It was where I began the talk. It's the suffering of having no mediation, no community, save whatever community you build for yourself, of course, but nothing that can actually support you in your identity. You are alone, and you do not have a given identity that you can rely upon. You're alone with the project of your own self-making. This is the source of our contemporary anxiety. I think it is the source of the psychoanalytical movement, and its roots are the Theology of Cross of Martin Luther. So, thanks for your attention.